Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Joining us on the line is Jack Buckby. He's author of Monster of Their Own Making. He is a conservative author and researcher from the north of England. His new book details his experiences in the far right as a teenager and analyzes how people are radicalized to the far right. Jack, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
So there's been a lot of talk in the American media, particularly about radicalization to the far right. Obviously, we have seen an upsurge in white supremacist violence in the United States. By the same token, we've also seen this vast effort by the media to label anyone who is right of center a member of the far right. So why don't you first define what it means to be far right, and then tell us how you think people get radicalized into it.
I think the idea of what far right is an interesting point. Now, whenever there seems to be one of these far right attacks, perhaps shootings at synagogues and things, I think it's very easy for conservatives to just pin it on the left by saying that the attacker was a socialist and he had left-wing political views. But at the end of the day, when they're shooting up a synagogue, they're not doing it with economics in mind. They're doing it with the far-right extreme end of conservative thinking. And of course, as a European, perhaps conservative can mean a different thing here. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the big problems is that we fail to recognize what the actual definition is. We fail to recognize also how easy it is for young men to enter these political circles when really no politicians are interested in representing them and the media are intent on attacking them.
So given that, I mean, first of all, let's make the distinction very quickly between American conservatism and British conservatism. So American conservatism, typically speaking, has been about limited government and God-given rights and a universal ethic, actually, that is very much opposed to sort of segmenting populations. Obviously, the right in Europe has typically not been in favor of a lot of those things. And so I think that distinction is worthy of being made. With that said, it is amazing to watch. And I've actually been disquieted by it when some on the right in the United States have tended to downplay the threat of white supremacism as though it doesn't exist or as though it's not a real thing. As somebody who's been targeted by threats from white supremacists, obviously that is not the case. I mean, it's a very real threat. How large is the threat of far-right radicalism? Is it broader in Europe or in the United States?
Well, I think, it would be very easy for someone on the left of politics to say that actually the far right is, really the most prevalent threat right now. They might say that Boris Johnson's election is a representative of the far right, or that the populist parties in Europe are representative of the far right. I don't think that's true. I think that they could be described largely as democratic populists, but this threat of neo-Nazi terrorists and white nationalists is small but growing. I don't make any attempt to conceal the fact that I do think it's small but growing. I think the problem is that it has the potential to grow. And in fact, in the United States, we know the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism has showed that actually the majority of ideologically motivated violent attacks in the U.S. are committed by far-right extremists today. And I think it's important for conservatives to acknowledge this and to reclaim that narrative on extremism.
Well, Jack Buckby is author of Monster of Their Making. So let's talk about how people have been radicalized into the far right. I do see it as a growing phenomenon, particularly in the online spheres. You talked about marginalization and how democratic marginalization plays a role here. So how do people end up believing what I think by any mainstream view are insane, racist, terrible things about people?
Well, I can tell you, in the book, I describe what I call a three-pronged attack. And this is a lack of representation from the politicians and unwillingness to talk about things like immigration. I believe it's also part to do with the media calling young white men racist, or at least the agenda of pro-working class people, politicians, racist. And then, of course, the final part of that attack is how the far left will viciously attack anybody who dare say anything about immigration. That's particularly true in Europe. And I've seen this myself. The young man who I talk about, Jack Renshaw, in the book, he was a lad from my hometown. He was perfectly normal when I knew him. He went down the populist sort of nationalist route because in our working class town, it was very deprived. The politicians didn't really represent us. And what he found is that the media ended up attacking him. The people in his college ended up attacking him and marginalizing him. And within no time, he was taken in by the most extreme wing of the political party we were involved with. And he became a neo-Nazi before my eyes. And now he's in prison on a life charge for terrorism even.
So how should people stop this process from occurring? Now, Steven Pinker gave a speech in the United States a couple of years ago for which he was widely derided by the political left. He said, one of the big problems is that on the political left, there's a tendency to take questions that people have and then just silence the questions. And instead of providing alternative answers that are better than the answers of the far right, they just say, you can't ask the question. This leads people to the only answers online being the answers of the far right. And then they feel like they've been lied to because the left refuses to even acknowledge
Right.
the question. So you mentioned immigration, for example. He says things like, when people say the gender gap, like why is there a gap between what women earn and what men earn? And the left says you can't even ask that question. That question itself is sexist. And people start looking and then seeing answers from the far right about how women are inferior to men and start believing that. What is the best way for Pinker said this? He was ripped up and down for it, for suggesting that this justified activity on the far right. What is the best way for rational people to try and convince people to stay away from the far right?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I might just add, I think a key problem we have is that the far right keeps getting proven right by the far left. When they shut down any kind of discussion about uncomfortable topics, and the only people, or at least some of the most significant people talking about it, happen to be white nationalists, for instance, then you can see why young men find themselves disillusioned and angry and going down that route. I think the way of solving this is for conservatives to be willing to talk about this uncomfortable issue from the perspective of accepting that the far right exists in the same way that the far left exists. I think that's on conservatives to do. But I also think it's on liberals, too. I don't think there's any use expecting the far left to do anything. They are ideologues. They will never change their mind. However, sensible liberals, people like Dave Rubin, for instance, I think are really important in this fight because it takes liberals standing up for their own values and saying that the far left doesn't represent them to remove the power from the far left. And don't forget, conservatives pointing that finger back at the far left and saying, you people are the reason why people move to the far right is extremely powerful.
Well, Jack Buckby, he's the author of Monster of Their Making. Jack, before you leave, I just wanted to ask about your own experiences in the far right as a teenager. So it seemed like you suggest that you were sort of sucked into this maw. How did that happen?
Well, in the UK, you may have heard about the issue with Muslim grooming gangs, and that was certainly one of the issues that pulled me in as a youngster, as a teenager. I find myself in a party called the British National Party, which was a white nationalist political party. And in 2009, they got 1 million votes. Now, I don't for a moment think there were 1 million neo-Nazis in Britain, but 1 million people were desperate enough for problems like that to be solved, for the white working class to be listened to. And I was just one of those people. And I've spent the last 10 years being demonized and treated like a leper, frankly, by conservatives and liberals alike. And I just want to use my experience, as I detailed quite extensively in the book, what happened to me, how I saw young men become terrorists right before my eyes, men that I knew. I think there's a lot to learn from it. And we can solve political extremism. It might just take listening to a former far-right extremist to solve it.
Well, Jack, I'm glad that you moved in the right direction and away from all of that, and I'm glad for your advice here. Jack Buckby, the book is Monster of Their Making. Go check it out right now. Jack, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Well, coming up, we're going to be talking about impeachment. The Democrats